It all began with the sound of splashing water and the echo of laughter drifting across the cul-de-sac. The homeowner had just installed a modest backyard pool, nothing fancy, just enough to enjoy during the scorching summer months. At first, the neighborhood seemed pleased. Kids played, families mingled, and the backyard became a gathering place for friends and relatives who needed a break from the heat. But there was one neighbor who didn't share that sense of joy. She lived 3 houses down, a woman known to the rest of the block for her constant scowls and sharp remarks. People whispered about her behind closed doors, saying she thrived on complaints and thrived even more when others bent to her will. Her name wasn't remembered so much as her reputation, the resident, Karen. The first sign of trouble came when a letter appeared in the mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA, but it had the tone of authority. Typed neatly on plain paper, it accused the homeowner of disturbing the peace with excessive noise. The note ended with a thinly veiled threat: if this continues, there will be consequences. The homeowner shrugged it off at first. After all, it wasn't unusual for kids to cheer in the pool or for adults to play music at a reasonable volume. Nothing about the gatherings had been rowdy or disrespectful. In fact, most of the neighbors who had attended seemed grateful for the chance to relax together. Still, the homeowner took a step back, lowering the volume on the speakers and reminding guests to wrap up before it got too late in the evening. For a short while, it seemed like the problem had been resolved. But Karen was not the type to be satisfied so easily. Within a week, a second note arrived. This time it accused the homeowner of running illegal parties without permits. Karen claimed she had already reported the situation to the proper authorities. Of course, no police or officials ever arrived, because there was nothing illegal about a few friends gathering by the pool. But the tone of the message was escalating, and it was clear that the complaints weren't going to stop. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. The sun was blazing, the pool water shimmered like glass, and a handful of families gathered to escape the heat. Children splashed and giggled, adults sipped cold drinks, and the day unfolded without incident, until a shrill voice pierced through the air. Karen had walked over, arms crossed, face red with fury. She shouted from the sidewalk, demanding that illegal party be shut down immediately. Her words carried across the fence, heavy with accusation and dripping with disdain. Though the homeowner remained calm and didn't engage, the moment burned itself into memory. It was no longer just about the noise or the gatherings, it was about control. Karen couldn't stand the idea of others enjoying themselves in a way she couldn't dictate. Later that evening, another letter arrived. This one wasn't typed, it was handwritten, messy, and filled with underlined threats. Karen warned that she would take this as far as it needs to go. She claimed she would force the HOA to step in, and even threatened legal action. It was clear she had declared war, and she wasn't planning on backing down anytime soon. At first, the homeowner considered keeping things quiet, maybe even scaling back the pool use altogether. But as the days went on, neighbors began to approach quietly, each one sharing their own story of Karen's meddling. One had been harassed over the color of their shutters. Another had been accused of letting their lawn grow too wild. Someone else had even received complaints for having wind chimes. It became obvious that this wasn't about one pool, one homeowner, or even one party. Karen had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, and people had simply learned to endure her wrath. But now, with the pool as the center of her attention, the homeowner realized they had a choice. At first, the homeowner considered keeping things quiet, maybe even scaling back the pool use altogether. But as the days went on, neighbors began to approach quietly, each one sharing their own story of Karen's meddling. One had been harassed over the color of their shutters. Another had been accused of letting their lawn grow too wild. Someone else had even received complaints for having wind chimes. It became obvious that this wasn't about one pool, one homeowner, or even one party. Karen had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, and people had simply learned to endure her wrath. But now, with the pool as the center of her attention, the homeowner realized they had a choice. They could continue to bow to her threats, or they could push back. The idea of a massive neighborhood pool party had been born in a moment of quiet defiance, but it didn't take long for it to grow into something bigger. At first, the homeowner wasn't sure how others would respond. People had dealt with Karen's constant meddling for so long that many had simply resigned themselves to silence. But if this plan was going to work, it needed more than one person's determination, it needed the support of the entire block. The first step was casual conversations. While watering the lawn, while picking up the mail, while walking the dog, the homeowner began to quietly float the idea. At first, the neighbors were cautious. They glanced around nervously, as if even speaking against Karen could summon her wrath. But then, as the conversations deepened, something shifted. One family recounted how Karen had once tried to force them to repaint their house because she didn't like the shade of beige. Another family explained how she had called animal control on their harmless cat, claiming it was a feral threat. Stories poured out, each one more ridiculous than the last, and the more they shared, the more laughter replaced fear. It became clear that Karen wasn't some untouchable authority. She was simply a bully who thrived on intimidation. That realization changed everything. One by one, the neighbors agreed to join the plan. Not just by attending, but by contributing. Someone offered to bring tables. Another volunteered speakers and lights. A couple of families promised food and drinks, while others said they would help decorate. Slowly but surely, what had started as a single idea turned into a community effort. The energy spread quickly. Soon, people from streets over were hearing about it and asking if they could join too. It wasn't just a pool party anymore, it was shaping up to be a full neighborhood festival. The more Karen pushed, the more united everyone became. Still, there was risk. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. If she caught wind of the plan before it happened, she would do everything in her power to shut it down. That meant secrecy was key. Instead of public invitations, neighbors whispered plans during morning jogs or late-night walks. Emails were carefully worded, and phone calls were short and coded. They spoke of the cookout, the gathering, and the big day, all while keeping the real details hidden until the time was right. Meanwhile, the homeowner began preparing the backyard. The pool was cleaned and treated, fresh lights were strung along the fence, and extra chairs were borrowed from anyone willing to lend them. With each new addition, anticipation grew. The backyard was no longer just a poolside hangout, it was becoming the stage for the neighborhood's rebellion. But as preparations intensified, Karen began to sense that something was brewing. She lingered outside more often, glaring from her driveway, scribbling notes on a clipboard she carried everywhere. Cars that parked on the street seemed to receive extra scrutiny. Even the sound of two neighbors talking was enough to make her step closer, pretending to water a plant while eavesdropping. Her suspicion became obvious the day she cornered one of the neighbors in their driveway. She asked pointedly if any suspicious gatherings were being planned. The neighbor, keeping a straight face, simply shrugged and changed the subject. Karen walked away unconvinced, muttering about keeping the neighborhood safe. The homeowner knew time was running short. The plan had to be executed soon, before Karen gathered enough clues to try shutting it down preemptively. The date was set for the upcoming Saturday. Invitations were confirmed in whispers and nods, with promises of music, food, laughter, and the loudest splash Karen had ever heard. As the week dragged on, excitement pulsed through the neighborhood like electricity. The quiet cul-de-sac, once subdued under Karen's shadow, was buzzing with anticipation. Children whispered about it at bus stops, adults exchanged knowing looks while mowing lawns, and even the elderly residents, who usually kept to themselves, expressed interest in stopping by. The homeowner couldn't help but smile at how far things had come. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about unity. Karen had spent years dividing the community, making people feel isolated and powerless. But now, the pool party had become a symbol of resistance, a chance to reclaim their street and show that joy couldn't be controlled by one bitter neighbor. By Friday night, the preparations were complete. The pool sparkled under strands of twinkling lights. Coolers were lined up, filled to the brim with ice and drinks. Tables were set, waiting for trays of food. Music playlists had been crafted to keep the energy alive well into the night. Every detail had been carefully arranged, and the stage was set for the biggest event the neighborhood had ever seen. But even as excitement built, there was an undercurrent of tension. Everyone knew Karen wouldn't take this lightly. When she finally discovered what was happening, she would explode, and nobody knew how far she'd go to shut it down. Still, the neighbors were ready. For once, they weren't afraid. They were standing together, and this time, Karen would have to face them all. The sun set on the final evening before the party, and the neighborhood buzzed with secret preparations. The homeowner took one last look at the backyard, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation. Tomorrow would change everything. And as the quiet night gave way to dawn, the neighborhood braced itself for the clash that was about to unfold. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of golden sunlight that seemed to announce something special. The street was calm at first, but there was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air. Families bustled in and out of their homes, carrying trays of food, folding chairs, and coolers. Children darted across lawns with towels slung over their shoulders, while neighbors exchanged subtle nods and smiles. It wasn't just another summer day, it was the day the block had been waiting for. The homeowner was up early, making final adjustments to the backyard. Balloons bobbed gently along the fence, banners fluttered in the breeze, and the pool sparkled like a gem at the center of it all. Music equipment had been set up, tested, and positioned to fill the air with just enough sound to be lively without crossing the line into chaos. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, burgers, pasta salads, chips, desserts, and a rainbow of drinks chilled in ice. By noon, the first guests began arriving. At first it was just a trickle, 2 families with kids, then a couple carrying trays of barbecue. But within an hour, the trickle became a flood. One by one, cars pulled up, doors slammed, and laughter filled the street. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other in years greeted one another like old friends, bonded by the simple joy of coming together for something bigger than themselves. The backyard transformed into a festival. Children shrieked with delight as they splashed into the pool, tossing beach balls and racing from one end to the other. Adults mingled around the tables, plates in hand, laughing over shared stories of past Karen encounters. Music pulsed softly at first, then louder as the crowd grew bolder. There was dancing, games, and a kind of freedom the neighborhood hadn't felt in years. It wasn't long before Karen noticed. She had been lurking since the early morning hours, pacing in her driveway like a guard on patrol. When the first waves of laughter carried down the street, her head snapped toward the sound. By the time the smell of barbecue drifted across the cul-de-sac, her face had already turned crimson with fury. She stood with arms crossed, muttering to herself, as car after car parked along the curb. When she finally realized what was happening, that nearly the entire neighborhood had gathered for a single massive pool party, her composure cracked. She stormed down the street, clutching her ever-present clipboard, her heels striking the pavement like thunderclaps. Karen's arrival was hard to miss. Even the children paused mid-splash as her shrill voice cut through the air. She shouted about illegal gatherings, safety hazards, and public disturbances. Her words carried more by rage than reason. But something was different this time. Instead of silence, instead of nervous apologies, she was met with something she had never faced before: laughter. Neighbors chuckled, shook their heads, and turned their backs to her tirade. Some even clapped their hands to the beat of the music, drowning out her words entirely. It was an open confrontation, but it was enough to make clear that the neighborhood had chosen joy over fear. Frustrated, Karen retreated to her home, but not before scribbling furiously on her clipboard and vowing, loud enough for all to hear, that this will be reported immediately. The moment she disappeared behind her door, a cheer erupted from the crowd, and the music cranked higher. But the battle wasn't over. Just as the party reached its peak, children splashing, music pumping, grills sizzling, flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. A police car rolled slowly forward, siren silent, lights glinting in the midday sun. Conversations hushed, and a ripple of unease spread through the party. People exchanged worried glances, wondering if Karen's threats had worked. The car stopped just outside the homeowner's house, and the officer stepped out. Karen appeared instantly, rushing from her door with the smug grin of someone who believed victory was within reach. She pointed wildly at the backyard, painting a picture of chaos and lawlessness. For a moment, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The officer listened patiently, nodding as Karen unleashed her tirade. Then, without a word to her, he walked into the backyard. The crowd stiffened, waiting for the verdict. He took in the scene, the pool, the music, the food, the families mingling peacefully. Children laughed as they cannonballed into the water, adults smiled nervously but greeted him warmly. After a few moments, the officer nodded approvingly. The music wasn't too loud. The gathering wasn't unruly. There were no violations, no crimes, nothing worth shutting down. He reassured the homeowner that everything looked perfectly fine, then calmly walked back to Karen, who was practically vibrating with anticipation. When he explained that the party was well within the law and that no action would be taken, her face contorted in disbelief. She sputtered protests, demanded that he do his job, and even claimed she was being harassed by the noise. But the officer simply shook his head, climbed back into his car, and drove away. The silence that followed was shattered by an explosion of cheers. Neighbors clapped, whistled, and raised their glasses in triumph. The party surged back to life with even more energy than before. Music swelled, the grill fired up again, and laughter rolled across the street like thunder. Karen, however, wasn't finished. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Curtains twitched as she peeked out, watching the celebration continue without her. Inside those walls, her fury simmered. She had lost this battle, but it was clear from the fire in her eyes that she was already plotting her next move. The homeowner looked around at the sea of smiling faces, feeling a wave of pride. For once, the neighborhood had stood together. They had faced Karen head-on and won, at least for now. But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't rest until she found another way to strike back. The night was young, the party was alive, but the war with Karen had only just begun. The pool party had been a success beyond anything the neighborhood imagined. Laughter and cheers echoed into the night, neighbors bonded like never before, and for the first time in years, the cul-de-sac felt free of the shadow Karen had cast. But as the final guests left and the lights dimmed, there was an unspoken understanding among them: Karen wasn't finished. She had been humiliated, ignored, and dismissed by the very people she believed she controlled. That kind of blow was not something she would let go. The first signs of her retaliation came quietly. On Monday morning, several neighbors discovered letters taped to their doors. They were written in Karen's distinct, sharp handwriting, dripping with accusations. One accused a family of operating an unlicensed food service because they had brought trays of barbecue. Another letter claimed that the loud music had violated city ordinances and warned that fines would follow. A third accused parents of child endangerment for letting their kids near the pool. Most people rolled their eyes and tossed the letters straight into the trash, but Karen didn't stop there. By midweek, official-looking complaints began arriving in the mail. She had filed reports with the HOA, the local code enforcement office, and even the fire marshal. Each complaint exaggerated the party into something dangerous and unruly: blocked emergency exits, unsafe swimming conditions, fire hazards from the grills. Inspectors began making rounds. They showed up politely, clipboards in hand, clearly embarrassed to be there. Each time, they looked around, asked a few questions, and left with the same conclusion: nothing was wrong. The homeowner had done everything by the book, and the party had been completely legal. Still, the constant stream of inspections was exhausting and disruptive, and it became clear Karen's strategy was persistence. If she couldn't shut down the party outright, she would bury the neighborhood in paperwork and fear. But her obsession didn't stop there. Late at night, neighbors began noticing her prowling the street with her phone in hand, snapping photos of parked cars, front yards, and even people walking their dogs. She scribbled notes furiously, muttering to herself about violations and evidence. One neighbor spotted her crouched behind a bush, taking pictures of the homeowner's pool lights, which she later claimed were a safety hazard for pilots flying overhead. Her behavior escalated to the point where children were frightened to play outside, worried Karen might report them for loitering. Parents grew anxious, frustrated that a single person could disrupt their peace so thoroughly. And yet, Karen seemed energized by the resistance, feeding on her own indignation like fuel for the fire. The tipping point came 2 weeks later. Without warning, the HOA board announced an emergency meeting. Karen had demanded it, insisting that community order was at stake. The homeowner knew immediately that the meeting was about the pool party, and the rest of the neighborhood prepared for another showdown. The night of the meeting, the room was packed. Residents filled every chair, some even standing. Along the walls. Karen sat at the front, clipboard in hand, her expression smug and triumphant. She presented her case with the passion of someone convinced they were saving civilization itself. She accused the homeowner of running a commercial entertainment business, of endangering children, and of creating a nuisance property. Her words were sharp, dramatic, and carefully chosen to instill fear. But when she finished, something unexpected happened. Instead of silence or cautious nods, the room erupted with voices. One by one, neighbors stood and told their side of the story. They spoke of years of harassment, of endless petty complaints, of the joy that had finally returned during the pool party. They defended the homeowner, not just for throwing the event, but for uniting the neighborhood in a way Karen never had. The more people spoke, the more Karen's control crumbled. Her face flushed red as she realized she was outnumbered. The HOA board, once swayed by her relentless pressure, looked increasingly uncomfortable. They shuffled papers, exchanged glances, and finally admitted they had found no violations. The pool party had broken no rules, and Karen's accusations had no merit. When the decision was announced, Karen erupted. She slammed her clipboard on the table, shouted about corruption and betrayal, and stormed out of the meeting in a fury. The door slammed behind her, rattling the walls, and for a moment, the room sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, applause began to build. The homeowners, united by her defeat, clapped not just for the decision, but for themselves, for finally standing up to the person who had held them hostage for so long. But as the applause faded, the homeowner couldn't shake a sense of unease. Karen had been publicly humiliated twice now, once at the party, and again at the meeting. If her past behavior was any clue, she wasn't going to stop. She was going to escalate further, reaching for bigger weapons, digging deeper into her arsenal of complaints and schemes. And they were right. Later that night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, Karen sat alone in her house, staring at her computer screen. Her eyes burned with rage, her fingers clicking furiously as she typed out new complaints, this time not just to the HOA, but to higher authorities. She wasn't just trying to shut down a party anymore. She was determined to crush the homeowner completely. The neighborhood had won a battle, but the war was far from over. By now, Karen's feud with the homeowner had grown beyond simple annoyance. What began as complaints about noise had spiraled into a vendetta, and with every defeat, her anger intensified. The party had embarrassed her, the HOA meeting had humiliated her, and the neighborhood solidarity had stripped away the power she once wielded through intimidation. But Karen was not the type to surrender. Instead, she doubled down. The first signs of her new offensive came in the form of official letters. Unlike her previous handwritten or printed notes, these came from actual government offices. Somehow, Karen had managed to file so many complaints, and with such creative detail, that local authorities were forced to respond. The homeowner received a notice from the zoning department alleging that the pool was an unpermitted commercial facility. Days later, another letter arrived from the health department, claiming reports of unsanitary water conditions. Soon after that, an envelope from the tax office appeared, demanding clarification about whether the property was being used for business purposes. Each claim was absurd, but each required time, energy, and documentation to refute. Inspectors returned again, testing the water, measuring property lines, and walking through the backyard as though they were investigating a crime scene. Every time they found nothing wrong, but Karen's relentless stream of accusations made life feel like a constant siege. Neighbors rallied once more. Families dropped by to offer help with paperwork, food, or even just encouragement. Kids volunteered to pick up trash or mow lawns, hoping to make the property spotless so inspectors couldn't twist anything into a violation. What had started as one homeowner's battle had truly become the neighborhood's cause. But Karen was clever. When the complaints failed to stick, she turned to sabotage. One morning, the homeowner awoke to find the pool filled with garbage, plastic bottles, food wrappers, even a broken lawn chair. Another time, the light strung along the fence had been cut, wires dangling like severed veins. Security cameras eventually caught the culprit, Karen herself, skulking through the night with trash bags in hand. The footage was shared quietly among neighbors, confirming what everyone already suspected. Some wanted to press charges immediately, but the homeowner hesitated. The truth was clear, but they knew Karen's rage would only deepen if she felt cornered again. The breaking point came late one Friday night. The homeowner returned from work to find a bright orange notice taped to the front door, "Cease and desist, pending investigation." According to the notice, the property was accused of violating residential zoning laws. If the investigation didn't clear quickly, hefty fines would follow. For the first time, the homeowner felt the full weight of Karen's campaign. It wasn't just about a pool anymore, it was about survival. The stress, the endless paperwork, the constant inspections, it all piled up until the thought of giving in, of simply shutting down the pool and ending the fight, began to seem tempting. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon a crowd gathered in the homeowner's driveway. Families who had enjoyed the pool, children who had laughed in the water, even elderly neighbors who had sat quietly at the party, each one stood in solidarity. They weren't going to let Karen drive out the one person. That night, a meeting was held in the homeowner's backyard. Neighbors shared stories, ideas, and strategies. One resident, a retired lawyer, offered to help fight the complaints legally. Another, a contractor, volunteered to double-check the property lines and permits. Someone else suggested starting a petition to show city officials that the entire community supported the pool. The atmosphere was different this time. The first pool party had been about fun and defiance, but this was about survival and justice. It was no longer just about one homeowner standing up to Karen, it was about the neighborhood declaring that they would no longer be ruled by fear. Meanwhile, Karen watched from her window, her silhouette barely visible through the curtains. She saw the gathering, the whispered conversations, the signs of resistance. And though she smiled to herself, confident in her complaints and paperwork, she underestimated the resolve she had created in those around her. The battle lines had been drawn more clearly than ever. On one side was Karen, armed with complaints, sabotage, and obsession. On the other was an entire neighborhood, united not just by a pool, but by a shared determination to reclaim their peace. And as the night drew to a close, one thing became certain: the final confrontation was coming. The question wasn't whether Karen would strike again, it was how far she would go, and how the neighborhood would respond when she did. The weeks that followed were tense, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Karen's campaign of complaints had escalated to the point where even city officials grew weary of her endless accusations. Inspectors arrived less frequently now, some even rolling their eyes as they admitted they were just following up on another report. It became clear that her credibility was crumbling. But Karen was nothing if not relentless. After being dismissed time and time again, she plotted her final strike. If she couldn't shut Moment, stepped forward with printed petitions, photos, and even video recordings. They handed them to the officers, showing proof of Karen's harassment, her midnight sabotage, and her endless stream of baseless complaints. One neighbor played the security footage of Karen dumping garbage into the pool, her face clearly visible under the harsh glow of a streetlight. Another produced copies of her threatening letters, covered in underlined words and wild accusations. The evidence was overwhelming. For years, Karen had hidden behind her role as the loudest voice, but now her actions were laid bare in front of the very authorities she had hoped would silence her neighbors. The officers turned to her, asking for an explanation. Karen's composure cracked instantly. She stammered, shouted, waved her clipboard wildly, insisting that she was the victim. But the more she protested, the more unhinged she appeared. Finally, when she refused to calm down, one of the officers escorted her back toward her home, warning her that filing false reports and trespassing could carry serious consequences. The crowd erupted in cheers as Karen disappeared behind her door, this time without the satisfaction of control. For once, she hadn't silenced the neighborhood, she had silenced herself. The celebration roared back to life, bigger and brighter than before. Neighbors danced in the street, raised their glasses, and congratulated one another for standing strong. The homeowner stood at the center, not just as the target of Karen's fury, but as the spark that had united an entire community. What began as one person's pool party had become the event that broke years of fear and intimidation. From that day on, Karen's power dwindled. She still glared from her windows, still muttered under her breath, but the neighborhood no longer cared. When her letters appeared, they went straight into the trash. When she tried to complain, she was ignored. And when she threatened, she was laughed off. Down the pool with letters, laws, or sabotage, she would stage a spectacle to prove once and for all that the homeowner was in the wrong. It came during the neighborhood's second big gathering. By then, the community had decided that the best way to fight Karen's bitterness was with more joy, more unity. They organized another event, this time bigger than the last. It wasn't just a pool party anymore, it was a block-wide celebration. Barbecues lined the sidewalks, children rode bikes festooned with streamers, and music echoed warmly through the street. For the first time in years, the cul-de-sac felt alive. Karen watched from her window, seething. As the party reached its peak, she made her move. Dressed sharply, clipboard in hand, and phone ready to record, she stormed toward the gathering with all the authority she could muster. She shouted about violations, demanded the music be shut down, and claimed the street was being illegally occupied. Cameras turned toward her, not in fear, but in curiosity. Neighbors had grown used to her tirades, but this time, something felt different. Karen dialed the police herself, making a scene of it, narrating loudly into the phone about rowdy mobs and unsafe conditions. The party fell quiet for a moment, tension crackling as people wondered whether the authorities would take her side again. Minutes later, police cars pulled onto the street, two this time, lights flashing. Karen's face lit with triumph as she pointed toward the gathering, certain that victory was finally within her grasp. She demanded arrests, fines, and immediate dispersal. But the officers didn't head straight for the homeowner. Instead, they split up, speaking calmly with different groups, asking questions, and assessing the situation. Everywhere they looked, they saw families eating, children playing, and music that was lively but not disruptive. It was a party, nothing more, nothing less. Then came the twist. Several neighbors, prepared for this very. The pool, once a symbol of Karen's anger, became a beacon of joy. Week after week, families gathered there, children swam, music played, and the laughter of the community echoed down the street. No matter how much Karen scowled, she could never erase what had been built, a neighborhood bound together by resilience, defiance, and the simple decision to choose joy over fear. And so, the story of one backyard pool party became the story of an entire block taking back their freedom. Karen had tried everything, threats, complaints, sabotage, but in the end, it was her own bitterness that destroyed her grip on the neighborhood. The homeowner didn't just win. The whole community did.